Okay, you remember that in the last video we talked about the principle of utility. This is Bentham's basic moral principle, and it states that actions are good to the extent to which they promote the pleasure or happiness of a group of people, and they're bad to the extent to which they promote the pain or unhappiness of a group. We need to see now a little bit more about what Bentham means by the happiness or unhappiness, pleasure or pain of a group, what he calls a party whose interests are under consideration. So he asks the question this way. He says, what do we mean by the interests of a community? In other words, the interests of a group, okay? And he defines it in a way that would today be controversial. People would question whether or not this was an adequate definition of the interests of the group. But I would like to share with you how he thinks of it and his reasoning behind it. It's actually fairly simple. It's maybe the simplest way that you could estimate what the interests of a group are. So he starts out by saying that a community is a fictitious body composed of individual persons who are considered as constituting its members. The interest of the community then is just the sum of the interests of the several members who compose it. So the basic idea there is when you know the interests of each individual, say you have 5 individuals in a group, we'll just find out what the interests are of individual 1 and find out what the interests are of individual 2 and of individual 3 and so on, and then add them all up together, and that will give you the total interest of the group. So that basically is Bentham's answer to that question of how do you tell what the interests of a community are? Well, how do we tell what the interests of each individual in the group is, though? Okay, Bentham has an answer to that too. And again, it's a controversial answer. It's an answer that you can argue with, you might not agree with, but it's a fairly simple and simple answer. So it's fairly easy to understand what he means by it. Okay, and what he says is that the interest of an individual is basically just the pleasure or pain that would be caused by various possible courses of action. So he says a thing is said to promote the interest or to be for the interest of an individual when it tends to add to the sum total of his pleasures, or what comes to the same thing, to diminish the sum total of his pains. It's interesting, you notice that repeatedly Bentham says what comes to the same thing when he's describing pleasures and pains. The idea there again is that there's a kind of continuum, a kind of continuous spectrum or continuum between more pleasurable things, less pleasurable things, neutral things, painful things, and very painful things, okay? So that they can kind of be ranked on a spectrum and could even be given numbers where the very pleasurable things are given like high numbers, like a 10, and the very painful things are given low negative numbers like negative 10, okay? And so then he concludes, an action may be said to be conformable to the principle of utility when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than any it has to diminish it. Now I'd like to give you an example. So imagine that I'm trying to decide whether or not to send out chocolate samples to the entire Philosophy 242 class this semester. So every student that I have for Philosophy 242, I'll get their address and I'll send them a free little chocolate sample because I've found some kind of good deal that would allow me to send out these samples to all the students, okay? And I'm trying to decide whether or not I should do that. And I want to do whatever it is that the principle of utility recommends that I do, okay? So what I need to do is find out whether sending out these chocolate samples actually is in the interests of the community. That is, does sending out the samples better serve the happiness and pleasure of the community overall, the overall community's interests, than not sending the samples, okay? And the way to do that, if I follow Bentham's recommended procedure, is I look at each individual and I ask of each one, would that action that I'm considering taking lead to more pleasure or more pain overall. So say the first student that's considered here really likes chocolate, and so there's a +8 on that side of things. But they also sometimes get a toothache when they eat chocolate. So they get a toothache when they eat the chocolate that arrives to them in the mail. So they have a +8 positive utility and a -2 negative utility. And to find out the interests of the community as a whole, I just do the same procedure for each individual. So the next student, say, really likes chocolate, and the only downside is that it's a kind of annoying to have to individually unwrap each chocolate. So they have a +12 for positive utility and a -1 for negative. The next student likes chocolate quite a bit, but they're also on a diet and they're not very good at kind of stopping themselves from eating sweet things. So they're going to eat the chocolate and then feel bad about it. And the bad feeling overall is going to be worse than the good feeling they get from the chocolate. So this student will receive a +6 positive utility, but a -7 negative utility. Okay, so I don't need to make up a story for each of these students, right? I think you kind of get a sense of how it would go. There could be, an infinite number of stories that could be generated here for these students. The point is that from a utilitarian perspective, there's some kind of estimate that can be given for each individual in the group that's affected by the action. There's some kind of estimate that can be given for each individual as far as how much total pleasure and total pain will be caused by the proposed action. And then finally, the last step that we take to determine whether or not we should take the action, this is the last step I would take if I'm trying to decide whether or not this is the right action to take by the principle of utility, as Bentham defines it and describes it. I would just tally up the numbers here. What's the total positive utility that's generated by sending these chocolate samples to everybody? And what's the total negative utility? And unfortunately, in this little model of the classes, we find out that the negative utility is greater than the positive utility. Maybe because there are a couple of individuals for whom there's a whole lot of negative utility, like the first one in the second row here and the third one in the second row. There's a lot of negative utility for them. Why? Maybe they are just really offended that a professor would take the step of getting their address and sending them chocolate. They might think it's inappropriate for a professor to be sending food to students. What's the point of that? We don't have that kind of personal relationship. It's more a professional relationship. That would be very weird. Some are, creeped out that the professors asked for their addresses, so maybe worried, maybe anxious. So I'm kind of, again, giving a kind of a colorful story to flesh this out, but some actions end up generating, when you kind of do the calculus, it looks like they generate more positive utility overall, and others look like they generate more negative utility overall. And the ones that generate negative utility overall shouldn't be taken, according to the principle of utility, and the ones that generate more positive utility overall should be taken. Now, in this case, there are a couple of small qualifications that I want to make just to show you that it's not that hard, starting from this kind of framework, to make decisions about slightly more complicated things. So let me just go through a couple of qualifications like that now. So for large groups, or when one has limited information about individuals in a group, one can think of kinds of representative cases. So one can make approximations. One can say, well, probably 20% of the students, or based on survey data, 20% of the students are either allergic to chocolate or on diets that prohibit consuming chocolate. That wouldn't be a result of, say, wouldn't have to be a result of, say, getting information from every one of the 100 students that I teach this semester. Could just interview, kind of ask or ask some survey questions, and even if only 20 students respond out of the 100, one could take that as representative of the larger group. So even though it's hard sometimes to gather information about the total pleasure and pain of each individual in a group affected by an action, it's possible to make some approximations to what the total pleasure and pain of the group is. So that's the first qualification. The second qualification is the following. So in the example I just gave you, I was trying to decide between either taking an action or not taking the action. That's a case of a decision with only two possible courses of action or two options, okay? But in some decisions, one might be comparing multiple plans. Say, one is considering multiple possible city planning programs going forward in the next fiscal year. And so we have plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, and so on, and we're comparing those different plans and trying to decide which one generates the most utility. That's possible too. So what the principle of utility would recommend there is, just like in the two-option case, we calculate the total positive and negative utility generated by each option, and then, or each plan, okay? And then we go with the plan, we choose the plan among those that has the highest positive utility payout. And if none of the plans have a positive utility payout, then we don't adopt any of them, because we would just be making things worse by adopting one of them. Bentham quickly goes on to claim that the principle of utility should apply not only to every action of a private individual. That is, it's not just that we should use the principle of utility to make decisions in our individual decision making, but it should also apply, he says, to every measure of government, which is a pretty bold claim. What he's saying is that when we write laws, when we decide how to organize our societies, we ought to set up our laws and societies so that they meet the principle of utility, so that they further the overall pleasure and the diminishment of the overall pain of the group of people that they affect. That is, the citizenry, and maybe people in other countries and places as well, insofar as our government policy has effects on them too. And this government application, this application to legislation and to public policy, is part of why the title of Bentham's book is An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, because he takes it that this theory is one that should apply at the level of politics and governance, as well as individual moral decision making.